It all began with a fairy tale. Or at least, that's what the world was led to believe. Prince Harry, the golden boy of the royal family, meeting Meghan Markle, the actress with ambition in her eyes and a smile that could light up a room. A romance so cinematic it seemed scripted, designed for magazine covers and glossy tabloids. The world watched as Harry and Meghan's love story unfolded. The secret courtship, the dazzling engagement announcement, and the global fascination that followed. But what if the fairy tale you thought you knew was built on lies? What if the love story the media sold you was hiding something far darker? Tonight, we peel back the curtain, revealing the truth that Prince Harry uncovered. A truth so shocking, so personal, that it forced him to make the hardest decision of his life. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Imagine waking up one day and realizing that everything you believed in was a carefully constructed illusion. That's where Harry found himself, not in the cold halls of Buckingham Palace, nor under the scrutiny of a million cameras, but in the quiet of his own home, facing a reality that no public statement could prepare him for. And the world? The world had no idea what was coming. From the outside, the couple seemed unstoppable. Headlines praised their love, applauded their charitable work, and cheered their every public appearance. Social media celebrated their every move, with fans idolizing Meghan as a modern-day princess, one who broke barriers and challenged tradition. But behind the carefully curated images, private whispers told a different story. A story of ambition, manipulation, and, ultimately, betrayal. The question we need to ask ourselves is this: how much of what we see is real, and how much is a carefully staged performance designed to capture attention, influence opinions, and, in some cases, secure fortune? Prince Harry, who had spent his life navigating the treacherous waters of royal expectations and media intrusion, was about to find out. And what he discovered would change not only his life, but the very narrative that the world had been fed for years. To understand the gravity of the situation, we need to look at the context in which this marriage began. Harry was not just any prince. He was a man haunted by his past, the tragic loss of his mother, Diana, still fresh in public memory. He carried the weight of a family legacy that demanded loyalty, duty, and discretion. Meghan, on the other hand, came from a world where visibility was power. Every role, every interview, every public appearance mattered. Where Harry's world moved slowly, wrapped in tradition, Meghan's world moved fast, measured in likes, clicks, and headline impact. The collision of these worlds was inevitable, but no one anticipated just how explosive it would become. The early days of their courtship were, by all accounts, romantic. Private dinners, quiet walks, and stolen moments away from prying eyes painted the picture of a couple deeply in love. The public adored them. When they announced their engagement, millions celebrated around the world. But behind the smiles and the sparkling jewelry, cracks were forming. Subtle disagreements, quiet arguments, and conflicting expectations began to emerge. These weren't the kind of arguments that end in tabloids overnight. They were private, intimate moments that only those within the inner circle could witness. And sometimes, those closest to them saw things that the cameras never captured. The tension in a glance, the frustration in a sigh, the silent calculations behind polite smiles. Then came the first signs of ambition overtaking affection. Public appearances were no longer just celebrations of love. They became stages where image, influence, and personal gain intersected. Every outfit, every speech, every photo op was analyzed, dissected, and shared. For Harry, someone who had grown up under relentless scrutiny, it was one thing to be judged for being a prince. But to witness the woman he loved navigating that scrutiny with her own agenda, sometimes at his expense, planted seeds of doubt. And doubt, once it takes root, is incredibly hard to erase. It's important to pause here and consider the stakes. We're not talking about ordinary disagreements that any couple might face. We're talking about decisions that could affect millions, from public perception to private security, from personal wealth to family legacy. Harry was suddenly confronted with a reality in which his love, his trust, and his loyalty were being tested in ways he could never have imagined. And the most devastating part? He couldn't just walk away without consequences. Every move was observed, every choice debated, every action magnified on a global stage. But what was it that truly broke him? What was the revelation that forced Harry to reconsider everything he had believed about his marriage, his partner, and the life they were building together? It wasn't just the media leaks, the gossip columns, or the endless speculation. It was something far more intimate, far more personal, something that shook him to the core. It was the realization that Meghan had entered this marriage not solely for love, but for fame, influence, and fortune. A calculated ambition masked by charm, warmth, and a carefully curated public persona. Now, you might be asking, how could Harry be so sure? How could someone who had shared private moments, late-night conversations, and seemingly genuine experiences come to such a devastating conclusion? The answer lies in the patterns. The inconsistencies between public statements and private actions, the manipulations revealed in conversations with trusted advisors, and the evidence that slowly, painstakingly, added up to a truth too glaring to ignore. Harry, who had once been willing to overlook missteps for the sake of love, found himself facing the undeniable. He had been deceived. This isn't just a story about celebrity gossip. It's about human emotion, the fragility of trust, and the consequences of ambition unchecked by empathy. Harry's journey is a cautionary tale about the collision between personal desire and public expectation, about how even the strongest bonds can be tested by the allure of fame and power. And it's a story that resonates because, at its core, it is profoundly human. We've all faced betrayal, disappointment, or the painful realization that someone we trusted had ulterior motives. But few of us face it under the microscope of the world, where every decision is broadcast, every emotion dissected, and every mistake immortalized. As we delve into this story, prepare yourself for a roller coaster of emotions. From the dizzying highs of a glamorous romance to the gut-wrenching lows of betrayal, from public adoration to private despair, the journey of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle is a saga that transcends tabloids. It is a study of ambition, love, and the price we pay when we mistake illusion for reality. But even as the pieces fall into place, the story doesn't end there. Because once Harry confronted the truth, once he made the painful decision to step away, the repercussions rippled outward, touching everyone around them: family, friends, advisors, and the millions who had followed their story with bated breath. The consequences were immediate, dramatic, and, in many ways, irreversible. And just when you think you've understood the magnitude of the revelation, consider this: the most shocking twists were yet to come. Because while Harry's personal heartbreak was undeniable, the public fallout would be explosive, reshaping perceptions, igniting media storms, and forcing the world to question everything it thought it knew about the Sussexes. Secrets that had been carefully hidden were about to emerge, and the world would never see their story in the same light again. So I ask you, what would you do if the person you trusted most had entered your life for reasons you never imagined? How far would you go to protect yourself, your family, and your own sense of truth? And more importantly, what happens when the world is watching, waiting, and judging every single move? Prince Harry faced these questions head-on, and the answers he found would shatter expectations, redefine relationships, and reveal a side of Meghan Markle that few had ever seen. And fewer were prepared to believe. It all started like a dream, the kind of story that sounds almost too good to be true. Prince Harry, the young, charming royal known for his rebellious streak and undeniable charisma, meeting Meghan Markle, the bright, ambitious actress with a Hollywood smile and a presence that seemed to command every room she entered. From the moment their worlds collided, the public was hooked. The story practically wrote itself. A prince, a commoner, a whirlwind romance that promised a modern fairy tale for the 21st century. But as the cameras flashed and the tabloids swooned, few could see what was really happening behind the velvet ropes and glossy magazine spreads. And as it would soon become painfully clear, fairy tales often have a darker side. The first public hints of their relationship were subtle, almost cinematic in their execution. Friends whispered about private dinners in London, long walks through quiet streets, and moments stolen away from the ever-watchful eyes of the media. But even in those early stages, tension was simmering beneath the surface. Harry, raised in the rigid, tradition-bound walls of the royal family, was drawn to Meghan's independence, her modern approach to life, and her undeniable charm. She, in turn, was intrigued by Harry's vulnerability, his openness, and the freedom that seemed to hover around him despite the royal confines. To outsiders, it was a perfect match, a balance of tradition and modernity, privilege and ambition. But appearances can be deceiving. From the very beginning, Meghan was acutely aware of the world she was entering. She knew the power of narrative, the influence of media, and the importance of public image. Every outfit, every smile, every handshake would be scrutinized and dissected. Every word she spoke could become a headline, every gesture a symbol of alignment or rebellion. And she played the game well, blending charm with calculated poise, winning hearts both within and outside the royal bubble. For Harry, it was intoxicating. Here was someone who seemed to understand him in ways few could, someone who could navigate the treacherous world of media and public expectation with confidence. Yet behind that poise, there were shadows, subtle indications that ambition and strategy were always at play. The engagement announcement in November 2017 was a spectacle that gripped the world. A ring designed with pieces of Princess Diana's personal collection, a glittering public display of commitment, and the promise of a love story that would define a generation. Crowds cheered, newspapers sold out, and social media exploded with hashtags celebrating #RoyalLove and #Harry and Meghan. And yet, even amid the glittering fanfare, cracks were already forming. Small disagreements over protocol, subtle clashes over media strategy, and private frustrations hinted that this fairy tale was not entirely built on romance alone. It was built, in part, on expectations, image management, and the careful choreography required to maintain public approval. One of the earliest signs that this relationship was more complex than it appeared came from those closest to the couple. Friends and insiders recall moments of quiet tension, subtle arguments that the public never saw. It wasn't just a matter of two people navigating the challenges of a high-profile relationship. It was about two worlds colliding. Harry's upbringing had instilled in him a sense of duty, loyalty, and caution, while Meghan's experience in Hollywood taught her to seize opportunity, leverage influence, and cultivate an image. Sometimes those lessons clashed, sometimes they complemented each other, but always they shaped the dynamics of the relationship in ways that would later become significant. The fairy tale narrative was carefully maintained in public appearances. Every event, from charitable visits to royal ceremonies, was meticulously planned to present an image of unity, harmony, and love. Photographs captured the smiles, the hand-holding, the visible signs of affection that made fans swoon. Yet behind closed doors, private discussions revealed a different reality. Arguments over media strategy, disagreements about family priorities, and concerns over personal boundaries began to emerge. And while these moments were often small and subtle, they laid the groundwork for the larger revelations that would later shock the world. Media attention only intensified the pressure. Every headline, every rumor, every social media post became another layer of scrutiny. Meghan, aware of her own public brand, navigated this landscape with a careful balance of charm and assertiveness. Harry, accustomed to public scrutiny but less familiar with the manipulative tendencies of modern celebrity culture, found himself increasingly conflicted. How much of this world could he trust? How much of Meghan's persona was authentic? And how much was calculated for influence and attention? These questions, once whispered in private, would grow louder with each passing month, echoing in the corners of his mind where doubt and suspicion began to take root. Even in these early days, certain behaviors hinted at the complexities to come. Meghan's desire for control over media narratives, her careful curation of social interactions, and her strategic use of public appearances all suggested a level of ambition that went beyond the romantic. While love may have been part of the equation, there were clear signs that status, influence, and visibility were also factors. And Harry, despite his infatuation and genuine affection, began to notice patterns that troubled him. It wasn't just about jealousy or mistrust. It was about the realization that the woman he loved might have entered his life for reasons that extended beyond mutual affection. The juxtaposition of their worlds could not have been more stark. Harry, raised in the conservative, duty-bound environment of the royal family, valued loyalty, discretion, and long-term commitment. Meghan, having navigated the competitive, fast-paced world of Hollywood, understood visibility, media manipulation, and the currency of fame. Where Harry sought stability and authenticity, Meghan excelled in influence and performance. The collision of these values created tension, sometimes subtle, sometimes profound, that would eventually become impossible to ignore. And yet, for a time, it seemed manageable. The early months of engagement were filled with public displays of unity, charitable initiatives, and carefully orchestrated appearances that reinforced the fairy tale narrative. Fans, captivated by the story of a prince defying tradition to be with his chosen partner, rallied behind them. Media outlets published flattering pieces, interviews highlighted their compatibility, and the world seemed to cheer for the union. But the most important moments were not public. They were private, filled with unspoken concerns, growing doubts, and a sense that the story being told on camera was only part of the truth. As the engagement progressed, Harry began to notice subtle but undeniable signs that Meghan's ambitions were influencing their decisions. Invitations to exclusive events, strategic media placements, and calculated interactions with influential figures suggested a level of planning that went beyond love. These were not the casual, spontaneous gestures of romance. They were deliberate moves designed to consolidate influence, visibility, and power. And while Harry initially overlooked them, attributing them to excitement or enthusiasm, the pattern became increasingly clear. The woman he had fallen in love with was also a strategist, navigating a world of public perception with precision and purpose. Perhaps the most significant element of this early stage was the disconnect between public perception and private reality. To the world, they were a couple in love, united against external pressures and ready to redefine the monarchy for a new era. Privately, however, Harry was beginning to sense that the foundations of their relationship were more complicated than they appeared. Small disagreements became symbolic, personal choices were influenced by strategic considerations, and the line between affection and ambition began to blur. It was a revelation that would, in time, have profound consequences. So, what really happened behind the fairy tale? What did Harry see that made him begin to question everything? Friends would later recount quiet conversations where Harry expressed unease about the disparity between Meghan's public persona and private intentions. Subtle incidents, a comment here, a request there, an insistence on controlling narratives, began to accumulate into a pattern that was difficult to ignore. Harry, who had spent his life navigating the complexities of royalty and public scrutiny, was suddenly faced with the possibility that his love had been intertwined with ambition in ways he had not anticipated. And as these realizations grew, so too did the tension, the doubt, and the inevitable heartbreak. The fairy tale, for all its glamour, was starting to show cracks. And those cracks, initially subtle and almost imperceptible, would widen over time, leading to revelations so shocking that they would force Harry to make decisions no one could have imagined. Decisions about trust, loyalty, family, and ultimately, his own happiness. As the world continued to cheer and celebrate, Harry was grappling with a reality that few could see, a truth that would not remain hidden for long. And just when the world believed the story was simply a modern-day romance, the first hints of betrayal began to surface. Small signs, seemingly insignificant at first, revealed the contours of a larger, more unsettling truth. A truth that suggested Meghan's motivations might not have been purely about love. A truth that would, in time, force Harry to confront the ultimate question. How far would he allow ambition, manipulation, and secrecy to shape the life he thought he shared with the woman he loved? What really happens behind the palace walls? You see the glittering ceremonies, the perfectly staged photographs, the polished speeches, but what you don't see is a world of pressure, scrutiny, and unspoken rules that shape every move, every word, every gesture. Life inside the royal bubble isn't what you think. For Prince Harry, it was a world he had known since childhood. An environment of strict protocol, hidden expectations, and constant judgment. But for Meghan Markle, stepping into this universe was like stepping onto a stage where the rules were invisible, the critics were relentless, and the cost of misstep was monumental. The collision of these two worlds would soon reveal fractures no one could ignore. Harry's upbringing had been anything but ordinary. From a young age, he was acutely aware of the weight of his family legacy. Every action carried consequence. Every word could make or break a reputation, and the world's eyes were never far away. He learned to navigate this environment with a blend of charm, defiance, and caution. But even with this experience, the pressures of royal life were relentless. Constant media scrutiny, endless public appearances, and the expectation to conform while maintaining individuality left little room for personal freedom. It was a delicate balance, and one that Meghan would soon find both intoxicating and confining. Meghan, by contrast, had built her life in a world that rewarded visibility, strategy, and self-presentation. In Hollywood, the currency was fame, influence, and the ability to control your narrative. Every role mattered. Every interview was a platform, and every appearance had potential ripple effects. She understood the mechanics of media in ways few in Harry's world could comprehend. For her, the palace was a new kind of stage, one where the stakes were higher, the audience more critical, and the rules less transparent. It was a challenge, and an opportunity she seemed eager to embrace. At first, it seemed that the blend of worlds was promising. Harry brought familiarity with protocol and duty. Meghan brought charisma and modern sensibilities. Together, they appeared capable of bridging tradition and innovation. But as the days, months, and public appearances accumulated, subtle tensions began to emerge. Decisions that might have once been simple became fraught with complexity. A simple event, such as a charitable engagement, could become a battleground for control, image, and influence. Who would speak first? How should the media be managed? Which appearances advanced the narrative, and which threatened it? These were not trivial questions. They were questions that tested trust, partnership, and priorities. The media's role in this dynamic cannot be overstated. Every move was dissected, every gesture analyzed, and every headline amplified. Meghan understood this perfectly, navigating the press with calculated precision. Harry, on the other hand, had lived under this pressure for decades and had developed a mixture of resilience and wariness. But even he could not fully anticipate how Meghan's approach, direct, ambitious, and sometimes confrontational, would clash with the subtle, unwritten rules of royal life. Tension mounted as the palace became a theater not only for ceremonial duties, but also for the quiet negotiations, compromises, and confrontations that Harry would come to find exhausting. And then there were the family dynamics. The royal family, with its centuries of tradition, has its own rhythm, hierarchy, and expectations. Newcomers are observed, tested, and evaluated, sometimes in ways that feel subtle, other times in ways that are unmistakably direct. Meghan, as a newcomer, faced scrutiny from all angles. Every choice, her fashion, her speech patterns, even her social media activity, was analyzed for intent. Meanwhile, Harry struggled with his loyalties. The desire to support his partner, the responsibility to uphold family traditions, and the emotional cost of defending decisions under the constant glare of public and private attention. Even within this environment, Meghan's ambitions were increasingly evident. She sought not only to integrate, but to influence. Invitations to high-profile events, selective media interactions, and carefully curated appearances suggested a deliberate approach to building influence both within and outside the palace. Some saw this as strategic genius, others as subtle manipulation. Harry, ever the mediator, initially saw the positive side, believing that her influence could modernize the monarchy, protect him from negative media, and amplify charitable efforts. But as patterns emerged, questions began to surface. Was ambition driving these actions more than love or partnership? And if so, what did that mean for their relationship? The contrast between public perception and private reality grew sharper with each passing month. Outwardly, Meghan presented herself as a loving, devoted partner fully committed to Harry and royal life. Behind closed doors, however, whispers of tension, strategic maneuvering, and subtle coercion began to surface. Friends and insiders reported instances where Meghan's influence over decisions extended beyond what was normal for a new member of the royal family. She was navigating a complex environment with confidence, sometimes at Harry's expense. For him, the realization was gradual but increasingly unsettling. The woman he loved might not always be aligned with his best interests or the best interests of the family he cherished. The stress was compounded by Harry's own personal challenges. Grief over his mother's death, the constant media intrusion, and the responsibilities of royal duties weighed heavily on him. He was someone who had spent a lifetime balancing public expectation with private desire, and now he was confronted with the additional challenge of a partner whose ambitions were as large as her presence. The emotional toll was undeniable. Nights that should have been restful were filled with contemplation, doubt, and sometimes despair. Every interaction, every decision, became a test of trust, patience, and loyalty. And then came the first real test. A seemingly small disagreement over protocol at a high-profile event quickly escalated into a significant argument behind closed doors. What was minor to an observer became emblematic of deeper issues: control, influence, and differing priorities. Friends reported that Harry was increasingly concerned about the subtle ways Meghan was shaping narratives, relationships, and expectations. The question that began to gnaw at him was simple but devastating. To what extent could he trust her? To what extent was the woman he loved truly invested in the marriage? And to what extent was she invested in visibility, influence, and personal gain? These tensions were compounded by the constant media scrutiny. Every misstep, every disagreement, every awkward pause was magnified into a story. Meghan, savvy and experienced in handling publicity, navigated these waters with finesse, turning potential controversies into moments of opportunity. Harry, protective and emotionally invested, found himself in an impossible position, defending a partner he loved, managing family dynamics, and attempting to maintain personal integrity, all under the relentless gaze of the world. The palace became a pressure cooker of emotions, ambitions, and unspoken expectations, leaving little room for genuine respite. But what truly made life inside the palace so challenging was the disconnect between the public image and the private reality. Every smile in public, every carefully orchestrated gesture, masked tensions, strategic calculations, and emerging doubts. Harry, who had spent a lifetime learning to navigate these contradictions, began to see patterns that could not be ignored. Moments that once seemed benign now took on new significance. Words, gestures, and decisions revealed deeper truths about motivations, priorities, and loyalties. And slowly, a painful realization began to crystallize. The fairy tale the world celebrated might be hiding a very different story behind its golden veneer. So what did all this mean for Harry? It meant that he was facing a choice that few could understand: how to balance love, loyalty, and truth in a world where every decision was magnified, every word analyzed, and every gesture interpreted. It meant confronting the possibility that ambition, influence, and visibility were shaping his relationship in ways that threatened the foundations of trust, intimacy, and shared values. And it meant grappling with a reality that no amount of charm, protocol, or public affirmation could fully protect him from. And as Harry navigated these challenges, a critical question began to emerge. One that would define the trajectory of his life and the marriage he had entered with hope and excitement. If love is genuine, can it survive when ambition, secrecy, and strategic calculation take center stage? Or is the pursuit of fame and influence too powerful a force to coexist with trust and intimacy? For Harry, the answers would not come easily, and the consequences would reverberate far beyond the palace walls. And just when he thought he could manage the pressures, just when he believed that love might conquer all, the first undeniable signs of betrayal emerged. Quiet, subtle, but impossible to ignore, these revelations hinted at a reality that Harry was only beginning to understand. A reality that would force him to confront the ultimate truth about the woman he loved. And as the palace walls bore witness to this unraveling, one thing became clear: life behind the curtain was far more complicated, far more dangerous, and far more consequential than anyone outside could imagine. Every fairy tale has a first warning sign, a subtle moment that, at the time, seems insignificant, almost ignorable. But in hindsight, It becomes the first clue that everything is not as perfect as it appears. For Prince Harry, those first signs of trouble in his marriage to Meghan Markle arrived quietly, hidden beneath the glamour of public appearances, the applause of well-wishers, and the carefully curated image of a couple seemingly in love. But beneath the smiles and hugs, cracks were beginning to form, cracks that would widen, fracture, and eventually shatter the fairy tale that the world adored. The earliest indicators weren't dramatic. They were small, almost imperceptible, like ripples in a calm pond. A delayed response in conversation, a subtle dismissal of an opinion, or an insistence on controlling the narrative around even the most minor decisions. To most observers, these were trivial moments. But for Harry, raised in a world where perception and reality constantly collide, they were warnings. They were hints that the balance of love, trust, and intention might be shifting in ways he could not yet fully articulate. Friends and insiders recall the subtle tension building early in the engagement. Harry, who had always valued honesty, loyalty, and transparency, began to notice patterns. Meghan, on the other hand, appeared increasingly aware of how actions, words, and appearances could influence perception. Was this ambition, strategic thinking, or something more calculated? The lines were blurred, and with each event, disagreement, or private conversation, Harry found himself questioning intentions. One of the earliest flashpoints occurred over something seemingly minor, a planned charitable engagement. Details of the visit were scheduled to reflect traditional royal values, highlighting causes close to Harry's heart. Meghan, however, suggested changes, altering speeches, prioritizing certain guests, and even influencing media coverage to maximize exposure. On the surface, it might have seemed like proactive involvement, but to Harry, the changes began to feel less like partnership and more like control. The subtle shift from collaboration to unilateral decision-making was the first real indication that their visions for life together might not align. Another early sign was Meghan's approach to family and personal boundaries. While Harry had always been deeply loyal to his family, Meghan was reportedly cautious, at times dismissive, of traditional expectations. She sought autonomy, independence, and influence over the way the couple interacted with both sides of the family. This created tension, not out of mere disagreement, but because Harry felt caught between loyalty to the past and the allure of a new life with someone he loved. Audience, pause for a second. If your partner begins subtly redefining your family dynamics, how would you respond? Could you detect the first signs of a shift before it's too late? Even their media interactions began revealing inconsistencies. Meghan, with her Hollywood experience, navigated interviews with precision, projecting an image of warmth, partnership, and shared purpose. But behind the cameras, discrepancies emerged. Comments she made to friends sometimes contradicted her public persona. Advice she gave to Harry during private moments seemed calculated to steer outcomes in specific directions. While Harry initially dismissed these actions as enthusiasm or naivety, patterns began to emerge. The more he observed, the more undeniable the inconsistencies became. Perhaps the most unsettling early signs involved subtle emotional manipulations. Friends close to the couple reported instances where Meghan leveraged emotions to influence Harry's decisions. A sigh here, a pointed question there, a carefully timed expression of disappointment. Each instance alone might have been brushed aside. But together, they formed a pattern that suggested an underlying agenda. Harry, who valued authenticity, began to notice these behaviors not just as minor irritations, but as indicators of a larger strategy. One that prioritized influence, attention, and ambition over mutual trust. The honeymoon period, if it could be called that, was short-lived. By the time public appearances intensified, so did the internal pressures. Every event, every gala, every charity visit became a stage not only for the couple's love story, but for the subtle negotiation of influence. Meghan's experience in Hollywood gave her an edge. She knew how to turn visibility into power, how to navigate media scrutiny, and how to subtly shape public perception. For Harry, accustomed to royal life, but not the intricacies of celebrity strategy, it was exhausting. Emotional fatigue set in as he struggled to reconcile the woman he loved with the patterns he was beginning to recognize. financial dynamics also played a role in the first signs of trouble. Harry, already under immense scrutiny for personal spending and charitable contributions, noticed Meghan's keen attention to resources, deals, and opportunities. While financial savvy is not inherently negative, the timing and context raise questions. Was this strategic planning, or was it indicative of a deeper motivation? Friends later reflected that the early focus on material gain, visibility, and strategic alliances foreshadowed the more significant revelations that would emerge later. The public perception of the couple further complicated the tension. Fans adored them, media praised them, and social media amplified every flattering image. To an outsider, it seemed like a perfect union. But Harry, living at the intersection of private reality and public expectation, felt a growing disconnect. How could he reconcile the warmth and connection in private moments with the calculated, image-conscious actions that increasingly defined their public life? How could he trust someone whose behaviors seemed to oscillate between genuine affection and strategic manipulation? Audience, think for a moment. Have you ever noticed discrepancies between someone's public persona and private actions? How would you respond if the stakes involved family, legacy, and millions watching? And then there were the interpersonal dynamics with staff, advisors, and close friends. Meghan's integration into the royal inner circle was not seamless. Reports of strained relationships, subtle conflicts, and tensions with longtime aides began surfacing. While some conflicts are natural when someone enters a new environment, the frequency and intensity of these incidents raise questions. Harry, torn between protecting his partner and maintaining harmony, increasingly found himself in the middle. The emotional toll of mediating between loyalty, trust, and public expectation began to weigh heavily. Even small, everyday disagreements became symbolic. A conversation about scheduling could reveal differences in priorities. A minor argument over media exposure could indicate deeper conflicts about trust and intention. The accumulation of these moments, seemingly insignificant at the time, was building a narrative of concern and doubt. Harry, who had once been fully committed to the public fairy tale, began to recognize patterns that foreshadowed deeper betrayals. And this recognition, while painful, was necessary. It was the first step toward understanding the reality of his marriage. Perhaps the most telling early sign of trouble was the gradual erosion of intimacy and shared understanding. Conversations that had once been open, honest, and playful became cautious, strategic, and fraught with tension. Emotional exchanges, which are the lifeblood of any relationship, were increasingly clouded by underlying concerns about motives, influence, and hidden agendas. Harry, whose love had been genuine and unwavering, began to question whether the partnership he had entered into was built on mutual affection, or on a carefully curated set of ambitions that did not always include him. By the time these early signs became impossible to ignore, Harry found himself facing a stark reality. The woman he loved, who had initially seemed to share his vision, was increasingly acting in ways that suggested a parallel agenda. What initially appeared as minor disagreements, personality differences, or the natural challenges of blending lives, had evolved into something more complex, a pattern of ambition, influence, and subtle manipulation that could not be overlooked. And just as the cracks were becoming apparent, another, more shocking revelation loomed on the horizon. A truth so significant, so undeniable, that it would force Harry to confront the ultimate question about his marriage, his trust, and the woman he had vowed to spend his life with. What he discovered next would shatter the fragile balance they had maintained, exposing a reality the world had never suspected, and one that would have consequences far beyond the walls of the palace. It's one thing to suspect, it's another to know. For Prince Harry, the first signs of trouble had grown into a gnawing unease, but nothing could prepare him for the private revelations that would shake the foundation of his marriage. These weren't idle rumors, fleeting whispers, or stories fed to the press. These were truths he uncovered himself, truths so personal and undeniable that they forced him to question everything: the love he believed in, the partner he trusted, and the life they had begun to build together. The moment of realization didn't arrive as a dramatic confrontation or an explosive argument. It arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly, in conversations, in gestures, in patterns that suddenly clicked into place. Harry began noticing discrepancies between what Meghan said publicly and what she revealed privately, or sometimes refused to reveal. The carefully curated image of a devoted, loving partner began to unravel in ways that were subtle but impossible to ignore. And as these private revelations accumulated, the weight of their significance became impossible to deny. Friends who were close to the couple during this period recall the sense of isolation Harry felt. He couldn't share everything with family without risking leaks. He couldn't discuss every concern with advisors without worrying about confidentiality. And in the midst of this pressure, he discovered truths that were deeply personal and profoundly troubling. The first revelation was about intention. The realization that Meghan's motivations for entering the marriage may have been as much about influence, fame, and security as they were about love. The woman he adored, he began to understand, may have been operating with a calculated plan that didn't always include his best interests. Harry noticed patterns in behavior that were difficult to reconcile with the love story the world had embraced. Requests for media coverage that seemed unnecessary, strategic positioning at high-profile events, and subtle manipulations in conversations with family and friends all hinted at a level of orchestration that went beyond ordinary relationship dynamics. Each revelation, small on its own, compounded the emotional burden, forcing him to confront the uncomfortable reality. The person he had married might not be the person he thought he knew. Financial revelations also began to surface. Harry, who had always valued transparency and integrity, found himself confronting evidence of calculated decisions that seemed focused on wealth accumulation and strategic advantage. While some of these actions could be rationalized as practical or protective, the timing, secrecy, and context suggested a deeper motivation. Harry began to see patterns that painted a picture of ambition entwined with personal gain, patterns that could not be ignored. The private revelations extended beyond material matters. Intimate moments, conversations meant to build trust, and shared experiences began to reveal inconsistencies in Meghan's intentions. What appeared as spontaneity or charm was sometimes, in hindsight, strategic positioning. Moments that should have been expressions of love were occasionally tinged with subtle maneuvering, hints that the narrative she presented to the world was not always aligned with private reality. Harry, who valued sincerity above all, felt a growing sense of betrayal. Audience, ask yourself this. What would you do if someone you loved deeply began revealing patterns that contradicted the trust you had placed in them? Could you confront it? Or would you find yourself quietly questioning every gesture, every word, every shared memory? Harry faced this exact dilemma, living under constant scrutiny, with every choice magnified and analyzed, and with the weight of family expectation pressing down on him. As these private revelations continued, the impact on public perception became inevitable. Harry began to see how even minor inconsistencies could be amplified by the press, transformed into headlines, and weaponized in public discourse. Every argument, every disagreement, every decision was subject to interpretation, speculation, and judgment. The combination of personal betrayal and public exposure created a pressure cooker of emotions, leaving Harry increasingly isolated and uncertain about how to navigate the relationship. It wasn't just the media that magnified the consequences. It was also the ripple effect on family relationships. Discrepancies between private behavior and public presentation strained connections with family members, creating tension and distance. Loyal advisors, long trusted confidants, were caught between maintaining discretion and addressing emerging concerns. Every interaction became a negotiation, every conversation a test of loyalty, and every choice a potential public spectacle. The emotional weight of these dynamics left Harry grappling with one overwhelming question. Could love survive when intention, ambition, and secrecy collided so starkly with trust? The most shocking private revelation, however, went beyond behavior or strategy. It touched on the core of their relationship, the foundation Harry believed was unshakable. Evidence emerged, through conversations, patterns, and first-hand observations, that Meghan had entered the marriage with goals that extended far beyond partnership and affection. Ambition, visibility, influence, and, yes, wealth were driving factors. For Harry, someone who had always valued authenticity, empathy, and loyalty, this realization was devastating. The fairy tale, once luminous and full of hope, suddenly revealed a shadowed undercurrent, a calculated pursuit of personal gain that threatened the very bond they had built. It's crucial to understand the gravity of this moment. Harry wasn't acting on hearsay, speculation, or the biased perspective of outsiders. These were observations he made, conclusions he drew from patterns, and truths he could not ignore. The private revelations were corroborated by trusted friends and advisors, creating a convergence of evidence that left him with little room for doubt. The very love he had cherished now seemed intertwined with motives he could not reconcile. And the consequences? Immediate and profound. As Harry began to process the reality of these revelations, he also had to confront the public implications. The couple's image, carefully crafted for global audiences, was now fragile. Every appearance risked exposure. Every interaction could be misinterpreted, and every decision carried heightened stakes. The private truths had public consequences, and Harry found himself walking a tightrope between safeguarding his own integrity, protecting family relationships, and managing the world's expectations. As this tension escalated, the question of trust became paramount. Could Harry continue to invest emotionally in a relationship where the other party's intentions were in question? Could he reconcile love with betrayal, hope with suspicion, and public perception with private reality? The answers were unclear, and the emotional toll was immense. He was forced to navigate a maze of conflicting emotions. Grief over the loss of perceived honesty, anger over manipulation, disappointment in broken expectations, and sorrow for the disruption of a dream he had once held dear. Audience, imagine being in Harry's shoes. Every choice is scrutinized, every relationship analyzed, and every emotional response magnified. Now add the weight of discovering that your partner's motivations may not be aligned with yours. How do you respond? How do you protect yourself while navigating loyalty, legacy, and love? These are the questions Harry faced, and the answers would set the stage for decisions that no one outside could predict. And just when Harry began to fully grasp the magnitude of these revelations, the next shock arrived. A piece of information so undeniable, so personally devastating, that it forced him to reconsider the very foundation of his marriage. This revelation would not remain private for long. It had consequences that rippled through their personal lives, their public image, and the world's perception of the couple. The private truths were about to collide with public reality in ways that would shake the royal family, the media, and the millions who had once cheered their love story. Every fairy tale has its cracks. At first, they're small, almost invisible, hidden behind charm, laughter, and public appearances. But over time, these fissures grow, spreading in ways that cannot be ignored. For Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, the cracks began subtly, tiny tensions, minor disagreements, and fleeting frustrations, but they would eventually reveal a much larger truth about love, loyalty, and ambition. The first cracks were almost imperceptible. Friends and insiders reported that the couple, once inseparable in public, began showing signs of strain behind closed doors. Conversations that had been warm and playful turned tense. Shared plans became opportunities for disagreement. Trust, which had been the foundation of their relationship, started to show stress lines, bending under the weight of unspoken concerns and private frustrations. For Harry, who valued honesty and emotional connection above all, these moments were not just worrying, they were alarming. Public appearances often masked what was happening behind the palace walls. On camera, they smiled, posed, and held hands, projecting unity and affection. Off camera, however, the reality was far more complex. Arguments over media strategy, disagreements about family interactions, and subtle conflicts over decision-making began to erode the sense of partnership that had initially drawn Harry to Meghan. The disconnect between public perception and private reality became impossible to ignore. One early sign of these cracks involved media management. Meghan, with her Hollywood experience, navigated interviews and press coverage with remarkable skill. She knew how to frame narratives, leverage visibility, and influence public opinion. Harry, who had grown up in the royal spotlight, was familiar with scrutiny, but not the calculated precision Meghan brought to it. At first, he admired her confidence. But soon, he noticed patterns, subtle manipulations of events and interactions that seemed more strategic than affectionate. Audience, consider this. Have you ever noticed someone controlling situations subtly under the guise of helping? How do you know when strategy crosses the line into manipulation? Family dynamics added another layer to the tension. The royal family, with centuries of tradition, is a world of hierarchy, expectation, and scrutiny. Meghan's approach often clashed with established norms. She sought independence, influence, and visibility, sometimes at odds with family expectations. Harry, caught between loyalty to his partner and the responsibilities of his heritage, felt the strain deeply. Disagreements that might have once seemed minor became symbolic of larger issues: trust, influence, and differing values. Even social interactions revealed cracks. Staff, advisors, and close friends reported growing tension. Meghan's integration into the royal circle was not seamless. Subtle conflicts, strained relationships, and incidents of friction began to appear. Harry, who had always valued harmony and discretion, was increasingly forced into the role of mediator. Every disagreement carried emotional weight. Every choice risked creating tension, and the pressure was relentless. Audience, imagine being in his shoes. How do you navigate loyalty to your partner while maintaining integrity and protecting family relationships? Financial and logistical disagreements also emerged. Decisions about spending, visibility, and strategic positioning sometimes caused conflict. While Meghan's actions could be seen as savvy or practical, Harry began to recognize patterns that suggested ambition played a significant role. These were not isolated incidents, but a series of choices that, when examined collectively, pointed to priorities that were not always aligned with the partnership Harry believed they shared. Another key factor was emotional fatigue. The accumulation of subtle manipulations, strategic decisions, and constant scrutiny took a toll on Harry's emotional well-being. Nights that should have been restful became periods of reflection, doubt, and anxiety. He struggled to reconcile the public image of love and unity with private experiences of tension and subtle betrayal. The cracks, once small, were now creating chasms in his perception of their relationship. Even Meghan's social connections played a role in widening the cracks. Friends, advisors, and media consultants reportedly influenced decisions in ways that prioritized exposure, influence, and visibility over intimacy and trust. Harry began to see how external pressures, combined with private ambitions, could shape the marriage in ways that conflicted with his expectations. Audience, think for a moment. When outside influence starts affecting your most personal relationships, how do you maintain clarity and protect your values? The emotional consequences of these cracks were profound. Harry experienced a mixture of confusion, sadness, and frustration. He questioned his judgment, doubted his partner's intentions, and worried about the trajectory of their marriage. The love he had once taken for granted now existed alongside a growing awareness of disparity, manipulation, and conflicting priorities. The fairy tale, once vivid and enchanting, was starting to resemble something far more fragile and complex. And then came incidents that could no longer be ignored. Arguments over appearances, public messaging, and private interactions began escalating. Small disagreements turned into heated debates. Emotional intimacy began to erode as tension and suspicion infiltrated previously safe spaces. Friends and insiders recall moments when Harry would step back, overwhelmed by the accumulation of stress and betrayal, questioning whether the relationship he had entered into was based on shared love or a more strategic alignment of ambitions. The cracks also revealed a profound mismatch in values. Harry, who had been raised to prioritize empathy, loyalty, and family, found himself increasingly at odds with decisions and behaviors that emphasized status, visibility, and influence. These differences, subtle at first, became more pronounced over time. What had been a partnership grounded in affection and shared purpose was slowly evolving into a relationship strained by ambition and conflicting priorities. As the cracks widened, public perception began to become part of the challenge. The world continued to cheer for the couple, celebrating appearances, images, and sound bites. Social media amplified every flattering photo, every shared anecdote, and every public display of affection. But the applause, while gratifying, masked the private reality, a growing rift between two individuals whose personal goals, ambitions, and motivations were increasingly misaligned. Audience, reflect for a moment. Have you ever witnessed a relationship that looked perfect on the outside but was crumbling internally? How do you reconcile admiration for appearances with the private reality of conflict? For Harry, this tension became unbearable. He could no longer ignore the subtle signs, the repeated patterns, and the growing divergence between love and ambition. And just when the cracks seemed significant, when Harry had begun to accept that his fairy tale might not survive, the next revelation arrived. A truth so staggering, so undeniable, that it forced him to confront the ultimate reality about his marriage. This was not speculation, not rumor. It was evidence, direct and impossible to ignore. It forced Harry to ask a question no one wants to confront. Had the love story the world celebrated ever truly been based on mutual trust and affection, or had it been driven, at least in part, by ambition and calculation? Some truths are impossible to ignore. Some moments arrive with such clarity, such undeniable weight, that they instantly redefine everything you thought you knew. For Prince Harry, that moment came suddenly, and it changed everything. The suspicions, the quiet unease, the subtle cracks he had been noticing for months suddenly converged into a revelation so shocking, so personal, that it demanded immediate reckoning. The woman he loved, someone he believed shared his heart and his values, had a hidden agenda, and the implications were devastating. It started with a conversation, a seemingly ordinary exchange that suddenly revealed an extraordinary reality. Harry, who had long navigated the complex world of royal protocol and media scrutiny, found himself confronted with something he could neither rationalize nor ignore. Evidence, discreetly uncovered through trusted sources, private communications, and first-hand observations, suggested that Meghan had entered the marriage not purely for love, but with goals tied to influence, fame, and financial gain. For Harry, the realization was like a punch to the gut. Could someone he had trusted so deeply really have approached the union with such calculation? Friends close to Harry recall the moment with vivid clarity. He was shaken, his face pale, his voice barely steady as he processed the truth. The years of shared experiences, the laughter, the promises, all suddenly took on a new, complicated meaning. Had he been naive? Had he misread the signs? Or had the woman he loved been deliberately strategic all along, masking ambition with charm and affection? Audience, pause for a moment. Imagine uncovering something about someone you trust completely, something that changes everything. How would you even begin to process that? The evidence, while subtle in some ways, was undeniably consistent. Actions aligned with personal gain, statements contrasted with private intentions, and carefully orchestrated appearances revealed a level of planning that went far beyond ordinary ambition. Harry realized that what he had once interpreted as passion and dedication might, in fact, have been part of a broader strategy to elevate status, secure visibility, and ensure influence in a world that valued image above all else. Financial motivations were part of the picture, too. While Meghan had always appeared generous and conscientious about shared responsibilities, patterns emerged that suggested a focus on opportunity and leverage. Strategic media appearances, timing of public announcements, and selective management of high-profile engagements all pointed to a deeper layer of intention. Harry began to see how ambition had intersected with love, and the realization was painful. The love he had believed in might have been accompanied by calculation he hadn't anticipated. But it wasn't just ambition, it was the pattern of secrecy and selective disclosure that hit hardest. Harry, accustomed to honesty and transparency, was stunned by the depth of the private machinations he had uncovered. There were moments where information was deliberately withheld, actions were orchestrated behind his back, and appearances were carefully curated to project a narrative that suited Meghan's goals. For a man who had valued authenticity above all, this was a betrayal that cut to the core. The emotional toll was immediate and intense. Harry, who had always been protective, empathetic, and committed, found himself navigating a maelstrom of anger, sadness, confusion, and grief. He questioned every shared memory, every promise, and every gesture. Was the love he had felt genuine, or had it been intertwined with calculation and self-interest all along? Audience, reflect. Have you ever discovered that someone's intentions weren't what you believed them to be? How did you process that betrayal, especially if it involved someone you loved deeply? The revelation also had public consequences. Harry, living in the spotlight and under constant media scrutiny, could not process the truth privately for long. Every decision, every reaction, every emotional response was amplified, analyzed, and broadcast to the world. The intersection of private betrayal and public exposure intensified the pressure, forcing him to act carefully, strategically, and decisively. It was a level of scrutiny few could truly understand, and yet, the weight of the revelation demanded action. The shockwaves extended beyond the couple themselves. Friends, advisors, and family members, long trusted and consulted, were suddenly drawn into the emerging truth. Conversations that had once been routine became urgent, delicate, and emotionally charged. Every interaction had implications, every decision carried consequences, and every step forward required navigating a minefield of loyalty, secrecy, and ethical responsibility. Harry realized that he was not only dealing with personal betrayal, but also the broader impact on family, legacy, and public perception. Audience, consider this. What would you do if someone you loved had hidden ambitions that fundamentally conflicted with your shared life? Would you confront them immediately? Would you seek counsel? Or would you take time to understand the scope and implications before acting? Harry faced all these questions, often simultaneously, while under constant observation. The pressure was immense, the stakes were high, and the emotional burden was nearly unbearable. And then came the confirmation he had feared but couldn't deny. A series of actions, private communications, and carefully timed appearances left no room for misinterpretation. Meghan's intentions, previously suggested through patterns and subtle clues, were now undeniable. Harry, who had hoped for a moment of clarity or reconciliation, faced an unavoidable truth. The foundation of the marriage he had believed in was compromised. Love, while still present, was now intertwined with motives that he could neither ignore nor accept. The realization forced Harry into an impossible position. He loved Meghan, yet he could no longer ignore the reality of her ambitions. He valued honesty, loyalty, and transparency, yet he had been navigating a relationship where these principles were inconsistently honored. He wanted partnership, mutual support, and shared purpose, yet he was confronted with evidence of calculation, secrecy, and self-interest. The collision of these realities created a profound emotional crisis, one that would ultimately determine the trajectory of their relationship. Friends describe Harry's response as a mix of heartbreak and determination. He was grieving the loss of the ideal he had believed in while simultaneously preparing to act in accordance with his values and integrity. Every step, every decision, every interaction was weighed against the reality of the revelation. The emotional intensity was overwhelming, yet necessary. Harry could no longer rely on assumptions, wishes, or hope. He had to confront the truth head-on. And the consequences? Immediate and far-reaching. The revelation marked the turning point in the marriage. A moment after which nothing could return to the way it had been. Decisions about cohabitation, public appearances, and personal boundaries became critical. Trust, once fractured, could not easily be repaired. The pattern of secrecy, calculation, and ambition demanded resolution, and Harry, despite the pain, knew that action was inevitable. The world outside remained largely unaware. Fans continued to celebrate the couple, media outlets continued to project images of harmony, and social platforms amplified every staged moment of affection. Yet beneath the surface, a seismic shift was occurring. The private revelations had not only altered Harry's understanding of his partner, but had also set in motion events that would redefine the relationship, the family dynamic, and the public narrative. Audience, pause and reflect. When a fundamental truth about someone you love comes to light, how do you reconcile the affection you feel with the betrayal you have discovered? Can love survive when it is intertwined with ambition, calculation, and secrecy? Harry was about to face this exact question, and the answer would change everything. Every relationship has a breaking point, a moment when the weight of unspoken truths, hidden agendas, and accumulated tension becomes unbearable. For Prince Harry, that moment arrived not as a single event, but as a culmination of months of subtle betrayals, strategic maneuvers, and private revelations that had forced him to confront the reality of his marriage. The cracks he had noticed, the private truths he had uncovered, and the shocking revelations he had faced all converged into an emotional and psychological tipping point. It began with what seemed, on the surface, like an ordinary disagreement. Yet beneath that disagreement was a pattern, a recurring dynamic that had haunted Harry for months. Every conversation with Meghan that should have been about shared plans or mutual support had become a negotiation. Every expression of affection was tinged with uncertainty. Every decision about family, finances, or public appearances carried hidden calculations. And for Harry, who valued honesty, loyalty, and emotional transparency, the repeated patterns were suffocating. Friends close to the couple report that Harry had tried to address the tension privately, with compassion, patience, and openness. He sought dialogue, clarification, and understanding. But each attempt was met with resistance, deflection, or subtle manipulation. Arguments would escalate quickly, sometimes over trivial matters, revealing the depth of misalignment between their priorities and intentions. Audience, pause for a moment. Have you ever tried to communicate with someone you deeply care about, only to feel unheard or misunderstood? How would repeated experiences like this affect your trust and emotional well-being? The breaking point was not just about disagreements. It was about the erosion of trust. Harry had long believed that love required both affection and honesty, but he now faced a reality in which affection was present, yet honesty was inconsistent. Private revelations had already shown him patterns of calculation and ambition, and each subsequent interaction reinforced that reality. The love he had once taken for granted now existed alongside suspicion, doubt, and emotional fatigue. One of the pivotal moments involved a high-profile public event that had been carefully planned to showcase their unity. The event, meant to symbolize partnership and shared purpose, instead highlighted the growing dissonance. Meghan, reportedly focused on media perception and strategic exposure, made decisions that conflicted with Harry's expectations and values. The clash, minor to outsiders but deeply significant to him, crystallized the tension he had been feeling for months. The event ended with Harry feeling frustrated, marginalized, and emotionally exhausted. But it wasn't just public events that revealed the depth of the problem. Private interactions, the very spaces where love and trust should flourish, became arenas of conflict. Subtle manipulations, selective disclosure of information, and emotional positioning created an environment in which Harry felt he could not fully express himself without consequences. The emotional strain of navigating these dynamics began to take a toll on his mental health, his confidence, and his sense of self. Audience, imagine being in Harry's position. You love someone deeply, yet every interaction is shadowed by doubt. Every affectionate moment carries a hidden agenda. Every private conversation